Margaret and Edwin Hayes spent 41 years raising 3 children. They gave up everything, sleep, savings, dignity, so these children could have more in life. And in return, they loaded them into a van, drove them to a state-run facility, and divided the house among themselves, even before the van carrying their parents cleared the driveway. But these 3 children, whose names are Victor, Diane, and Marcus, had no idea what they had just thrown away. Hello friends and supporters, welcome to our story. Before we start properly, please like and subscribe. Also leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Atlanta, North Carolina, Chicago, maybe South Africa or Nigeria, we want to know. Now, let me take you back to the Genesis. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The sky over the Hayes property was pale and still, the air already warm by 7, and the magnolia tree Edwin had planted 30 years ago held its shade across the porch like a hand held over sleeping eyes. Margaret sat behind her husband on the top step, her fingers working through his thinning hair, parting it with the slow patience of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and intended to do it 10,000 more. Edwin held an orange in his lap, peeling it in one long spiral the way she liked, pulling the seeds out with his thumbnail before handing her each section. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. 41 years will do that. It builds a language between 2 people that has nothing to do with words and everything to do with hands, breath, and the quiet way one body learns to move around another. Edwin's hands were large and still steady then. Carpenter's hands. Hands that had built the back porch they were sitting on, had laid the tile in the kitchen, had once held all 3 of his children in the first hours of their lives. He handed Margaret the last section of orange, and she took it without looking, the way you take something from someone whose reach you know by feel. They were not expecting company. But at 9:20, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway and parked across the walkway like it owned the concrete. Victor got out first. He didn't wave, didn't call out good morning. He walked straight to the front door and let himself in without knocking. That had started about 3 years ago, the not knocking. Margaret had mentioned it once. Victor had looked at her like she was being unreasonable. Diane came next. She was carrying a manila folder, the kind with a metal clasp, and she held it against her chest, the way someone holds something they have been rehearsing with. She nodded at her mother on the porch, but didn't stop walking. Marcus, the youngest, stayed by the car. He leaned against the passenger door with his arms crossed and looked at the magnolia tree like it owed him something. Eventually, he followed the others inside. Margaret found them in the kitchen. Victor had the refrigerator open and was staring into it with the look of a man conducting an inspection. "There's nothing in here," he said, not to anyone in particular. Just a statement released into the room. Diane was already seated at the table, the manila folder open in front of her, papers fanned out like a hand of cards. Marcus stood by the window. His hands were in his pockets. We need to talk," Victor said. He said it the way people say things they have already decided. Not a conversation, a notification. Edwin came in from the porch. He looked at his 3 children, all of them in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning, none of them having called. And something crossed his face. Not a surprise exactly. Something older than that. He pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, his big hands resting flat on the table. Victor did most of the talking. He talked about their age. He talked about the stairs being a hazard. He talked about how Margaret had forgotten to turn off the stove last month, which was true, once, and how Edwin's knees were getting worse, which was also true. He talked about it the way a man delivers a quarterly report, organized, efficient, already past the point of input. Diane slid a brochure across the table. Comfort of Grace Senior Living. The photograph on the front showed 2 elderly people playing chess in a sunlit room. It looked like a hotel. It was not a hotel. Then she slid a second document, Power of Attorney. Edwin looked at the paper. He looked at the brochure. He looked at his son. "Whose idea was this?" he asked. The silence that followed was the kind that answers questions more honestly than words ever do. Victor glanced at Diane. Diane studied the table. Marcus, by the window, stared at his shoes. Nobody said a name. Nobody needed to. Margaret sat very still through all of it. Her hands were in her lap, fingers laced, and she did not speak. There's a particular kind of restraint that is often mistaken for acceptance. It is not acceptable. It is the decision to keep your dignity in a room that has decided you no longer need any. She excused herself to the kitchen, stood at the sink, ran the water so no one would hear her breathe, and then, through the window above the faucet, she heard Victor's voice, not the meeting voice, not the concerned son voice, but the real one. He was on his phone, just outside the back door, and he said it plainly. "Once they're out, we list the Macon place first. The house we split into 3 ways." Margaret's hands gripped the edge of the counter. Her knuckles went pale. 3 tears fell, one after the other, and she let them. Then she turned off the water, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, straightened her dress, and walked back into the room as if she had only gone to check on something boiling. Some people are moved by tears. These 3, she now understood, were not. The van came on a Thursday. White, with the facility's name on the side in blue letters. 2 men in blue uniforms loaded 3 suitcases, 41 years of life together, and it fit in the back of a van with room to spare. Diane hugged Margaret the way you hug a coworker at a holiday party, arms out, body back, duration timed. Victor shook Edwin's hand without meeting his eyes. Marcus hung behind and whispered, "It won't be long, Mama. We'll come visit." He said it softly. He might have even believed it. Margaret stood at the end of the walkway and looked back one last time. The magnolia tree, the porch, the front door, still the same dark green Edwin had painted it the summer Marcus was born. She looked at all of it the way you look at someone's face before a long surgery, memorizing it, or in case it comes back different. Then she turned and walked to the van and did not look behind her again. Comfort of grace. Senior living smelled like cleaning fluid and boiled cabbage, and something underneath both of those that had no name but that every person who has ever walked into such a place recognizes immediately. It is the smell of waiting. The hallways were bright, the beds were narrow. A television mounted high on the wall in the common room played game shows to a room of people who were not watching. Margaret and Edwin were assigned a room at the end of the east corridor. 2 beds, 1 window, a curtain between them that didn't reach the floor. The window faced a parking lot. Margaret stood at it for a long time that first afternoon, her hands flat against the glass, and said nothing. She met Miss Lorraine on the second day. Miss Lorraine had been blind since she was 60, and she moved through the facility with the slow certainty of someone who had memorized every wall and corner by touch. Every evening, at exactly 7 o'clock, she hummed the same hymn, just the melody, no words, and the sound carried down the corridor like something trying to find its way home. Margaret never asked her which hymn it was. She didn't need to. Mr. Gentry was in the room across the hall. He had been a school teacher for 38 years, and he still spoke in the careful cadence of a man used to being listened to. Every meal he set a place across from him, napkin folded, fork aligned, for his wife, Dolores, who had died 4 years before. No one told him to stop. That was the one kind thing about the place. Edwin began to fade within the first week. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was the slow withdrawal of a man pulling himself inward, room by room, locking doors behind him. He stopped eating lunch. Then he stopped walking to the courtyard. His hands, those carpenter's hands that had built porches and planted trees and held newborns, began to tremble when he lifted a cup. He would sit on the edge of his bed and stare at the wall across from him with the expression of a man watching something move very far away. There is a difference between not expecting something and experiencing the actual absence of it. Edwin had not expected his children to send him here, but sitting on that narrow bed, 73 years old, listening to game shows through the wall, he experienced the full weight of what their absence actually meant, and it pressed down on him like soil. Margaret watched this. She watched the way his shoulders rounded, the way his hands lay open in his lap like empty nests. One night, after the lights went out and the corridor fell quiet, except for Miss Lorraine's hymn drifting faintly through the walls, Margaret crossed the space between their beds and sat beside him. "I will not die in this place, Margaret," he said. He said it quietly, not with anger, not with self-pity, with the flat certainty of a man who has made a decision and is stating it aloud so the world can take note. She took his hand. It trembled in hers. "Then we leave," she said. She said it the way you state a weather fact. They left before dawn. No announcement, no argument with the night staff. They simply walked out through the side door that no one bothered to lock because no one ever used it. Margaret carried one bag. Edwin carried nothing but himself, and that was almost more than he could manage. The highway outside the city was 2 lanes and had no shoulder. The Georgia heat was already building at 5 in the morning, rising off the blacktop in waves that made the road look like it was breathing. Edwin stumbled once on a loose gravel patch, then again a quarter-mile later. Margaret held his arm. His weight against her was new, and it frightened her, because Edwin Hayes had never leaned on anyone for anything in his life. She flagged a passing car. It didn't stop. She flagged another. Same. She stepped further into the road, waving with both hands at a delivery truck that swerved around her without slowing down. She stood there for a moment, arms still raised, watching the truck disappear. And then she folded her hands together and prayed. One sentence, simple and direct, the way she had always prayed, as if God were a neighbor she'd known for years and didn't need to impress. The brown pickup truck that pulled over had paint spatters on the fender and a toolbox in the bed. The man who got out was not tall, not short, not remarkable in any particular way. Samuel Dawson wore work boots and a shirt with his company name stitched above the pocket. He looked at the 2 elderly people standing on the side of the road in the rising heat, and he did not ask what they were doing there. He did not ask where they had come from. He said, "Let me help you to the truck." And he did. He drove them to the county hospital. He sat in the waiting room for 4 hours while they admitted Edwin and ran tests. A nurse asked Samuel if he was family. He said, "I'm the one who brought them." When Margaret finally came out, her face drawn and her hands still shaking, he was still there, sitting in the same chair, as if leaving had never occurred to him. Samuel brought Margaret back to his house that evening. His wife Ruth met them at the door with the expression of a woman who had already been told the situation and had already made up her mind about it. "The room behind the kitchen has a bed and a window," she said. "Towels are in the hall closet." That was all. No performance, no elaborate welcome. Just a door held open and a room made ready. When Edwin was released 3 days later, he came home to that room. Home. It is a word that shifts meaning depending on what you've lost. For Edwin and Margaret Hayes, that small room, maybe with its single window and borrowed quilt, became the world made real again. Ruth and Margaret found each other at the stove. It happened naturally, the way rivers find their grade. Ruth made peach cobbler on Saturdays, had done since her grandmother taught her at 12, and she showed Margaret the trick with the butter, how you slice it cold and let it melt in patches so the crust blisters. Margaret, in turn, taught Ruth how to season a skillet properly. Not her mother's skillet. That was gone, left behind in the house on Edgewood, sitting in a cabinet that belonged to her children now, but a borrowed one from Ruth's kitchen. "You treat it like skin," Margaret told her, running oil into the iron with her bare palm. "You've got to feed it to keep it alive." Ruth watched her hands move and nodded slowly. And something passed between the 2 women that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with trust. Edwin and Samuel found each other in the yard. Samuel was building raised garden beds from scrap lumber, and for the first 3 days, Edwin just watched from the back step, his hands in his lap. On the 4th day, he walked over and picked up a plank. He didn't ask if he could help. He just started measuring. The 2 men worked in near silence, exchanging only the necessary words. "Hold that end." "Hand me the 4-inch. "Soil's too wet yet." It was the kind of companionship that doesn't need performance, only presence. One afternoon, Edwin came back from the hardware store with a small magnolia seedling in a black plastic pot. He planted it at the far corner of the yard without explanation. Samuel watched him firm the soil around it with his palms and said nothing. Some things don't require comment. Over the weeks, something shifted. Edwin's appetite came back first, then his posture, then his hands. The trembling that had started at comfort of grace slowed, then stopped. His grip steadied. He held his coffee cup in the mornings without spilling. He began to whistle while he worked. Nothing recognizable, just scattered notes. The sound of a man whose body had remembered it was allowed to take up space. Margaret laughed for the first time one afternoon when a hard rainstorm overwhelmed the gutters and sent water flooding across the kitchen floor. Ruth shrieked, Samuel scrambled for towels, and Margaret, standing in the middle of it with water around her ankles, laughed until she had to hold the counter to keep standing. It was not a small laugh. It was the kind that had been stored somewhere deep and finally found its way out. The household became a family, not by declaration or ceremony, but by repetition, by meals shared and dishes washed and evenings on the porch where the only agenda was the weather and the quiet. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, or rather, the man who carried it did. Clarence Whitfield was an estate attorney from Macon with a calm voice and a briefcase that looked older than most of the documents inside it. He had been trying to locate Margaret Hayes for the better part of 3 years, and he had finally found her through the hospital records from the county admissions office. He sat across from Margaret and Edwin at the Dawsons' kitchen table and laid it out plainly. Margaret's grandmother, Grandma Olivia Tate, had passed away, and her estate had been sitting in probate. The estate was not small, $3.6 million, 2 rental properties in Macon. All of it was left to Margaret, the only surviving grandchild. Margaret listened without moving. Clarence Whitfield explained that letters had been sent to her old address, the house on Edgewood, for 3 years running. Certified, return receipt. Every single one had been signed for. Signed by whom? Margaret asked. She already knew the answer. She asked the question the way a woman pulls a thread she knows will unravel everything. Clarence checked his file. Various signatures. Victor Hayes, Diane Carter. Margaret looked at Edwin. Edwin looked back. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. 41 years. That language again, the one that doesn't need words. She saw the understanding settle across his face like a shadow crossing a field. The house, the rush, the manila folder, the power of attorney, the Macon properties mentioned on the phone. All of it. Every rehearsed word, every strategic silence, when every stiff hug at the van had been about the money. Not all of it, but enough of it that the difference didn't matter. 3 weeks passed. Margaret and Edwin said very little about the inheritance during that time. They took walks. They ate Ruth's cobbler. Edwin watered his magnolia seedling. The knowledge sat between them like a stone in a river. The current moved around it, but it didn't go anywhere. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, a black SUV pulled up in front of the Dawsons' house. Victor got out first. He was wearing a sports coat. Diane followed, carrying nothing this time. No folder, no brochure, no documents. Marcus came last, and he stood by the car the same way he always did, arms crossed, slightly apart from the others, as if proximity to the decision might make him responsible for it. "Mama," Victor said. He was smiling. We've been looking everywhere for you." Margaret stood on the porch and looked at her son. She looked at him for a long time, the way you look at a painting you once loved and now see differently. "Come inside," she said. "I'll get you some water." She served them water in glasses she'd borrowed from Ruth's cabinet. She asked about their drive. She asked about Diane's children. She moved through the small talk the way a woman moves through a room she has already decided to leave, present, but not invested. Victor, to his credit, maintained the performance longer than the others. He talked about how worried they'd been. He talked about the facility, how they'd gone to visit and found them gone. He said the word frantic. He used it twice. Margaret let him finish. Then she said, Clarence Whitfield came to see me." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Victor's smile didn't fall. It froze. Diane's hand moved to her lap. Marcus, who had been staring at the table, looked up for the first time. "He's a very thorough man," Margaret continued. "He showed me the receipts, the certified letters. 3 years of them." She paused. "You signed for them, Victor. Diane signed for the rest." There is a moment in every confrontation where the mask comes off. Not because someone tears it away, but because the face underneath can no longer hold it. Victor started to speak, stopped, started again. Diane began explaining. She used the word protecting. She used the word complicated. She said they had been waiting for the right time. Margaret listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap, in the same way she had listened to the meeting in her own kitchen months earlier. Except now her hands were still, not gripping anything, not trembling, just still. Edwin had been sitting quietly through all of it. He was in the chair by the window, the same seat he always took at the Dawsons' table. His hands were resting flat on the surface, palms down, firm and unshaking. When Diane stopped talking, He stood up, slowly, the way a man stands when he is not in a hurry and does not intend to repeat himself. "I built that house with my hands," he said. "I raised you in it. I fed you from it. I buried my pride 100 times to keep it standing." He was not loud. His voice was level, almost conversational. "You could have had everything I own just by asking, but you didn't ask. You moved us out like furniture, and you took what wasn't yours." He looked at each of them in turn. "I want you to leave now," he said, not with anger, something quieter and more terrible, the kind of calm that comes after a man has finished grieving and arrived at clarity. They left. Victor went first, already on his phone before he reached the car. Diane followed without turning around. Marcus was last. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. "I'm sorry, Mama," he said. Margaret looked at him. She looked at the youngest of her 3 children, the one who had stood by the car, the one who had stared at his shoes, the one who had whispered empty promises at the van, and she held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Small. She did not say she forgave him. She did not say she didn't. She left the door exactly where it was, slightly ajar. It was neither open nor closed. It was Margaret's idea. She said it one evening on the porch, watching Edwin water the magnolia seedling. "There are people in that place who have no one coming for them," she said. "Miss Lorraine, Mr. Gentry, others." She paused. "We could build something." Edwin looked at her. She looked back. One of those moments, the kind their 41 years had made fluent. He nodded. They used the inheritance, nearly all of it, to purchase and convert one of the Macon rental properties into a residential home for elderly people who had been abandoned or forgotten. It took 5 months. Margaret oversaw every detail, the wide porch with rocking chairs, the open kitchen with space enough for 6 people to cook at once, the private rooms with windows that faced something green. At the center of the courtyard, Edwin planted a magnolia tree, full-grown this time. He stood back and looked at it with his hands on his hips, and Margaret came up beside him and took his arm, and they stood there for a while, saying nothing, in the language that was entirely theirs. Miss Lorraine was the first resident. She hummed her hymn on the porch that first evening, and this time, the sound didn't drift down a corridor. It floated out across the yard and into the Georgia dusk like a benediction. Mr. Gentry came next. He set his place for Dolores at dinner, and no one told him to stop. The home grew. 8 residents, then 15, then 20. Edwin died 18 months after the doors opened, peacefully, in his sleep, in the room they shared at the back of the house. Ruth held one hand, Margaret held the other. His hands, those carpenter's hands, those father's hands, those hands that had planted trees and peeled oranges and trembled in a dark facility and steadied again in a borrowed garden, were finally still. His will was read by Clarence Whitfield in the same kitchen where the truth had first come out. To each of his 3 children, Edwin left $1, and to each a sealed letter. The letter said this: "You were my greatest pride and my deepest wound. I forgive you because holding this would poison the years I have left, but I will not leave you what you tried to take. I leave you the memory of who you chose to be." The remainder, every dollar, every property, went to the home. Margaret lived 4 more years. She cooked in that open kitchen every day. She learned the names and the stories of every resident who came through the doors, 32 by the end. Thus she kept Edwin's magnolia seedling alive in the Dawsons' backyard. She never reconciled with Victor or Diane. Marcus called once. She answered. They spoke for 11 minutes. She did not invite him to visit, but she did not tell him not to. When Margaret died, they found a letter in her nightstand, written in her own hand, addressed to no one and everyone. It said, "A home is not walls. It is the decision to stay when staying is hard. I found mine twice, once with Edwin and once with strangers who became family." The cast iron skillet, her mother's, the one she'd left behind, was found years later by Victor in the kitchen cabinet of the house on Edgewood. He held it for a long time. It was the heaviest thing he'd ever carried. If this story moved you, go ahead and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.